Now there's a new book out called the New York Times Book of New York that compiles 549 stories that have appeared in the pages of the Times over the 158 years of the paper's publication. So how well does a newspaper tell the story of a city? Well, we're going to talk to the editor of this new book, James Barron, New York Times correspondent, about some of the enduring stories of the city. Longtime reporter on the Metro staff of the Times is James Barron. Welcome to WNYC.
Good morning. Good to be here.
So let's go way back just for the fun of it, because the book goes way back. In the introduction to the crime section, you write about the first reported murder in New York, a stabbing in 1638. You didn't report that story, right?
No.
The perpetrator was never found. It's still a cold case. Tell me that story.
Two guys from Rotterdam had come over to New York, and they got in a knife fight. And one of them killed the other one, and they believed in those days, they believed in capital punishment. So the Dutch council that ran the city put out the word. They also didn't believe in innocent until proven guilty. They put out the word that if they found the perp, he was to be killed by sword. And he was never found. He must have gotten outside the walls of the city and was never found again.
How do you see that first New York City murder in the context of all the crime to follow? Is that too big a question?
Probably, but you can't help thinking about that when you do something like this. There has to be a beginning to everything, and so, of course, there was a first one. That's actually how the idea to look it up came into my mind. So many of the things in the book were things we were there, that the Times was there to cover. That's the point of the book. The plane that went into the Empire State Building at the end of World War II. Leonard Bernstein and how he made that debut at Carnegie Hall as a last-minute substitute for Bruno Walter. So much of this is the eyewitness to history that you get from a newspaper that was there and paying attention and watching things. Of course, in the case of that first murder, well, we weren't there. They didn't have newspapers yet, and yet we spend so much time as New Yorkers thinking about crime, and I think as newspaper people covering it, that when I was thinking what to put in the introduction to that chapter, that's where I got the idea of, well, when was the first murder anyway?
Although working on the Metro section these days, I wonder if you think New York was more defined by crime in the past, maybe as recent past as the 1980s and early 1990s, but, today we revel in being the safest big city in America.
The statistics do seem to show that. Of course, if it happens to you, it's personal, and the statistics don't mean anything.
You've been a Metro Desk reporter for almost 30 years. You wrote an article in July of 1995 on the 50th anniversary of that plane crashing into the Empire State Building that you just mentioned, at that time the tallest building in the world. Tell me about that story and why you included it.
Partly because doing this book now, you couldn't look back on that story and not think about what happened on September 11th. So I think that was one reason. Another reason was how everybody picked up and went on relatively soon after that. The Empire State Building was repaired, and people largely forgot about it. It was fairly easy to find people when I was doing that story. I called a friend, and he said, I know someone who was coming out of Altman's, which used to be across the street, now the CUNY Graduate Center, who didn't know to look up, but sort of was there for the whole thing. And the idea that 50 years later you could find someone who was very young, that's the kind of thing in New York, There's always somebody who saw it.
And one of the things that you tap into there that's really interesting is the perpetual anxiety about the tallness of skyscrapers in New York.
Well, you've got both things in the book, the anxiety about the tallness of it and the wonder of it, because in the architecture section we run a number of articles in the book that talk about the great wonder and the beauty of the Chrysler Building and the Spartanness, if you will, of the Empire State Building and the competition between those two and one downtown to be tallest. to really punch through the sky.
And you included in this collection an Ada Louise Huxtable article written in 1970 predicting the coming of a second skyscraper age in New York.
Well, I think now that we look back on that, and that was another of the reasons we included it. It's always fun to look back and see what we said about the future and how it has and hasn't come around.
It's interesting to put out this book now at a time when the newspaper industry is struggling to stay viable, at a time when there's no longer a separate standing Metro section in the Times. Do you think the next edition of this book is going to be harder to put together in 50 or 100 years?
No, I don't agree with the premise that putting the Metro section into the A section of the paper has cut down on our coverage. The space is the same. It's just in a different place, the Metro News. And in fact, the reaction I've been getting to articles I've written, I'm hearing from different people. I'm hearing from people who always looked at the A section as where the news was and never bothered with the B section when the B section had Metro News in it.
And now they're stumbling upon it.
And now they're reacting. So I tend to hear from I think a different group of readers. So from that standpoint, I think there'll be material. And I think all we're really doing in some ways is presenting it perhaps in a different place or perhaps in a different way. But I think we will get the contours and to mix a metaphor here, the grace notes as well as the big important developments in New York of however long a period you want to pick.